Good morning, good day, namaskar, namaste, vanakkam, and all of those greetings for people who are tuned in here in the United States. Some may be hopefully in India, and who knows, a few people from across the world. So I can't simply say good morning. It's 8 o'clock, 8:30 Eastern Standard Time here in the United States. My name is Ramesh and I'm very happy to be part of the series of talks that the Indic Book Club organizes every week. And so this week, it is a pleasure to be online, to be live, and to talk a little bit about the kind of opportunities that we have in India to know one another better. And it seems kind of strange, because if we think about Indian civilization, India as a nation, the culture, and so on, we take for granted that somehow there is a commonality, that we know each other, and that maybe there is not much for either a new field to probe into who we are, whether we know each other, and how we talk to each other. My background is in communication studies. I have a PhD from Michigan State University, and having taught nearly 30 years here in the United States, recently, about 5 years ago, maybe, a friend and I, Professor Avinash Thombre from the University of Arkansas, Little Rock, and I decided that we need to explore the possibility of using our expertise in intercultural communication and see India in that kind of a framework. So what is intercultural communication? It seems yet another newfangled approach to the study of people. Our attempt at understanding people through the kind of social studies or social sciences approach, mixed with the kind of humanities approach. And when we think about it that way, really we may feel, and rightly so, for those of us who have gone gray in our hair, to say, what is new in the world anyway? But then I think if we can step back and look at maybe what younger people, or maybe what people who may not have read about these matters could prosper from by studying ourselves, in this case, in such a way that we can throw light upon what are really some challenges. So, for example, if I can think of Assamese, okay, how much do I know about Assam? How much do I know about the languages? How much do I know about the ordinary day-to-day habits of the Assamese? And even when I say the Assamese, I am merely generalizing across a whole region which is home to a variety of people who speak a variety of languages. So we end up with stereotypes. Now, stereotyping we think of as mostly negative, but it did not be. Just like, for example, here in the United States, we have people stereotyping that Asians, under which we Indians are also included, are good in math and science. Okay. Now, that is a positive stereotype, but it is also what we would call, in terms of stereotyping, kind of limits us. Okay. So if you were someone who grew up in Delhi, and if you were to think south of the Vindhyas, it's kind of South India, or the old Oh, Madrasi. Really? I mean, sure, as a quick handle to kind of refer to someone who live south of the Vidyas, that is fine. But unfortunately, and to this day, we Indians, and I'm an Indian American. I came to this country 32 years ago. So I still have my foot, 1 foot in the United States, one in India, because I write a lot about India. I study India. We have ignored the possibility of educating our children, educating our people about the languages, the cultures, the habits, the mores, the foods, the music, a whole variety of life practices across the subcontinent. We cannot, of course, ignore Pakistan and Bangladesh, because after all, they were part of India, and they were merely kind of, artificially chopped off. But that is India. And India is the second largest country. And of course, if you include Pakistan and Bangladesh, India would be the largest country in the world. Now, how much really do we know of one another? And do we really care to put some time and effort to understand one another, and therefore be able to communicate with one another with a lot more success, with a lot more fluency, with a lot more ease, with a lot more concern, with a lot more understanding? Or do we wish to continue as we have done? Not that it is necessarily completely unsuccessful or inefficient. After all, as I have mentioned, we have lived together for millennia. And so somehow, we have lived next to each other in our own enclaves, or as if you want to use a negative term, in our own ghettos, or in our own little colonies. And while we have transacted with one another, we have just left the others be. Okay, you to yours, me to mine, and that has worked. Surely that has enabled the kind of diversity in India. And in fact, that is a strength of India's, because we have let others know you can do whatever you want in your own context, in your own spaces, and we will do our own in our own spaces. In fact, that is the strength of a system of communities that have enabled the kind of diversity in everything, from languages to food habits to music, to ways of observing all of these ceremonies from birth to death. Okay, and I think we can take part of that philosophy, and now, as a nation system, India as a nation, can we begin to pay a little bit more attention, so that we can continue to say, oh, you to yours, us to ours. But then we have to acknowledge this. As a nation system, we mostly live under one set of laws, even though, of course, we now have this whole debate about uniform civil code. And there is this whole conflict about this matter about you to yours and us to ours, because the nation seeks to bring about a standardization in laws that are applicable to everyone. Okay, so that's a whole different topic by itself. But I think we can, if we pay some attention, and I hope Professor Tombre and I have kind of kick-started this conversation, where we spend some time really not to kind of generalize about one another, not to stereotype about one another, and even forget about celebrating one another or tolerating one another and all of those kinds of things. It's just a matter of knowing one another. Okay? And I think that would be the first and maybe even the final step. Because in life, after all, in terms of our Indian civilizational values, what is the most important? It is knowledge. It's knowledge of the self. And the knowledge of the self can happen when we also pay attention to the knowledge of others. Okay. And here, I think the modern intercultural communication field, it will be a little helpful. And a very quick, brief tour through how this particular field has kind of emerged. Back in the 1940s, late 1940s, early 1950s, the United States, in a kind of a brave new world after the Second World War, realized that its diplomats needed to engage the world much more closely, much more effectively. They were establishing embassies all over the world. They were trying to help Europeans recover. They were trying to help the Japanese recover. They were, there was a whole lot of demand on American diplomats to know a lot more about the people that they were much more closely engaging with. With that came, a really kind of a serious need, and therefore they hired Professor Edward Hall, an anthropologist who had studied, his initial work was on studying Native Americans. And he had kind of discovered that, there are whole ways of looking at the world based on our own tribal, ethnic, linguistic, regional kinds of identities and practices and experiences. And he had begun to kind of put those, bits of knowledge that he had gathered working with, quote unquote, the Indian tribes here, the Native Americans. And he became the go-to person, and he was asked to help. He was asked to help train American diplomats. And so the last 7 decades now, the field of intercultural communication has kind of grown, and there is a whole bit of work being done by people across the world, but especially in the United States, where it has established itself as part of the communication field. Okay. And we look at everything from how people's worldviews are influenced, how language differences can lead to different, whether, for example, language differences lead to the ways of perceiving the world. What are the kinds of nonverbal communication differences? So when we say nonverbal communication, just look at the way I'm dressed today. Okay, I'm sitting here in my Georgia home and wearing a kurta and trying to show a little bit of my Indian identity, but that itself could be a distraction or an attraction based on who the viewer is. Okay, the whole setting behind me, for example, is also part of my nonverbal communication context. But nonverbal communication includes everything from how we greet one another. So there is a very interesting book titled Kiss, Bow, or Shake Hands, or Do Namaste. Okay, the book title doesn't include, folding hands in greetings. But those differences, if we don't know about those differences, can lead to misunderstanding, miscommunication. It could lead to the kinds of conflicts, unnecessary conflicts, because we don't understand one another and our behavior. We think something that I say in a particular tone or something that I do if I stand at a distance instead of closer, somehow the other person thinking that I am disrespecting him or her, the way I dress. These are all parts of nonverbal communication. And then our culture also makes us kind of perceive the world in different ways. So if you can think of worldviews, our understanding of the world is shaped by everything from our religious books and texts to our food habits, to our understanding of male, female roles in the world. Okay, and therefore, the intercultural communication field has kind of grown. There are quite a few scholars now working mostly again in the United States, but you can find them in places. Some places in Europe and some in Australia and so on, Australia and New Zealand, and maybe also the Chinese and the Koreans and the Japanese have begun to take note of this field. But we in India have not yet paid attention. We have kind of subsumed these bits of inquiries, knowledge pursuits in the traditional field of whatever cultural studies or maybe even in political science or international relations and so on. But we have not been teaching in Indian universities any courses in what you would call intercultural communication. So Professor Combre and I decided, hey, we need to kind of say whether this would be a useful way for all of us to help in the pursuit of knowing one another so that we can communicate with each other better and therefore maybe even help in the cause of nation building if you think that would be a good end. But that is not again the goal that we have in our book. Our book is basically about the kinds of ways in which we perceive the world and therefore how we misperceive one another. And therefore, the opportunities that we have to engage in the study of one another so that we can actually begin to understand one another better. Okay, so that is the broad and kind of a general summary of what we have done in some 350, 400 pages of our book, which you can see over my right shoulder. And for those of you who have already thumbed through the book, you may have some specific questions for me or comments. So what I'm going to do now is to open this up for comments. So if you can either, type in your comment or question, I'll be glad to respond to that. And as I wait for questions to pop up on my screen, let me talk a little bit about my own growing up in India and the kinds of challenges that I had figuring out neighbors, not just across the region, but even within the state that I grew up in, that I was born in. I was born in Karnataka, actually a small town close to Bangalore. It is now called Ramanagara. It used to be called Closepet. And so mostly I, as a young boy, grew up in the south side of Karnataka, what we would call Old Mysore. But as my father, who was an engineer working for the Karnataka government, was posted across the state, he was based in towns like Dharwad or Belgaum or Bidar or Raichur. And suddenly my world began to open up, because I found that someone in Dharwad did not speak Kannada the same way that I did back in Bangalore. I could not figure out why they had last names that were initially very funny for me. Last names like Mensinekai or Ittigi and Ullagadde. These are basically names of vegetables and grains, and Ittigi is a brick. How could someone have last names like that? Now that I look back, no one at that time, not in any textbook that at least I had in my school, discussed these matters. To tell children across Karnataka, you know what, children? Karnataka is a land of differences. People speak differently based on whether they are in Mangalore or Bangalore or Dharwad or Raichur. Because if we went to Raichur or Bidar, you heard a lot more Urdu being mixed in Kannada. And there was no discussion, no lessons about how we differed in food habits. What we ate in South Mysore. There might have been a little something about a farmer eating ragi mudde in Mandya and a farmer in Dharwad eating jawar roti. Okay. But they were very minimal. They were very superficial. So but then those differences were taken for granted. No one bothered to walk the children through those differences so that we could actually have children, know about these kinds of differences and talk about this and understand that India was a land of differences, and that's what made our choice in music. So, for example, when I growing up in the southern parts of Karnataka, heard my mother sing light classical music, Carnatic music, and then go up to Dharwad and Belgaum, where my father was posted as the local municipal engineer. I said, there was no real interest in Carnatic music. It was a land of Hindustani music, North Indian classical music. How was that so? There was no discussion. There was no engagement by our school teachers about these differences. They lived it. But then there was nothing in our lessons, in our textbooks, that enabled us to kind of talk about, celebrate, and understand all of these fantastic features just within Karnataka. So if I was so ignorant about Karnataka, how much more ignorant was I about the rest of the country? So when I for the first time, when I was in, I think, 9th grade, traveled by train to what was then Bombay, and at that time we didn't have the broad gauge railway tracks that ran from all the way from Karnataka to Mumbai. So we ended up taking the meter gauge train up to Pune, which was then Pune, and then had to change the train in Pune to go to Mumbai. And we got off the train in Pune. And I remember as a 14-year-old, kind of shocked when I stepped down onto the railway platform, a kind of a sea of red. And I asked my parents, what is happening? And they said, oh, it is just people chewing pan. and spitting. Now, that the whole idea of chewing pan was itself a kind of an eye-opening experience for me. The kind of regional habits that we have, okay? There was no one, again, my parents knew very little about this. It was, in fact, the first trip for them too, in terms of visiting Mumbai. So they were maybe as, surprised and as uncomfortable as I was as a 14-year-old traveling just across from one state to another. Okay. So there were language differences. None of us knew Marathi. Then luckily, I had an uncle in Pune and uncle and aunt in Mumbai who took care of us and all of those kinds of things. And it's a fascinating visit. But I think about, again, how, if only in our schools, we had a lot more discussion about our own differences in a variety of ways, rather than reading a whole bunch of Greek or British or American or whatever world history and literature and so on. I think English could be taught using the poems written by poets across India, and have us read those poems in translation, so that someone, a student in Uttar Pradesh, in Uttarakhand, or someone in Delhi would be as aware of a Dara Bendre as a South Indian student, a student from Karnataka, being aware of a poem written by Chitre or by, poets across India. Those were, again, the attempts are there, but it is still very minor. And therefore, we continue to stereotype one another. Oh, Sardarjis are like this. Oh, Andhra people are like this. Madrasis are like this. And I think, therefore, we end up basically being ignorant of one another, or have only a superficial knowledge about one another. And then, when there are conflicts, surely there are conflicts. Just take, for example, something like language conflict. We don't know how to deal with these issues. So, here again, I am waiting for questions from people across. I don't know if you are able to respond. Let me see. Let me minimize the window here and see if there is anything else going on. Okay, I believe you should all have gotten a summary of, my commentary here. I am still waiting to see if there is anyone interested in engaging on this discussion, and if indeed you're able to access my commentary. And if you would kindly type in your question or comment, I would be glad to respond to it. And I will wait a few, maybe a minute. I don't want to fill it with silence because as a professor of communication and someone who has been on radio and television, I also realize that no one likes silent spaces. Looks like I'm not able to kind of see the questions, but hopefully now that I have opened up another Facebook window, I can look across and see what the questions have been. And this is, of course, the challenge of technology and sometimes new technology, where if doing Facebook Live for the first time, I may not be looking at the right places. Okay, interesting. A question from Shruti. How can a Punjabi raised in Tamil Nadu make both communities understand their uniqueness? And this is happening more and more. It's not just person being raised. If I were born in Karnataka and raised in Delhi or Mumbai, that's one thing. These days we are seeing a lot more what we would simply call intermarriages, in the sense that a Punjabi marrying a Telugu girl, or a boy from Madras marrying someone from Gujarat, and so on. And I think the challenge, and I have quite a few in my family who have not only wedded people from across the world, but from across the country, which was quite rare in my parents' generation, and which was quite rare when I was growing up. So till maybe I was in my 20s, I had not seen this level of intermarriages. And I think that has happened because of the kinds of changes that we have seen in Indian society and across the world. The whole the world is flat approach, the globalization approach, the global village approach, and the advance of new technologies and so on, which has made people, Bangalore, for example, has become an attractive hub for people from all over India. So it's a question of basically asking one another questions, being interested in one another's backgrounds and life. I think we should all attempt to speak other languages. And here, I confess, I'm not very good. I lived in Chennai for 1 year, and my Tamil, I can understand a little bit of Tamil, but I have not tried speaking Tamil much. Whereas, for example, my wife, who grew up in Mysore, is as comfortable speaking Hindi and Malayalam and Tamil as she is in Kannada. And in fact, I tease her that her Malayalam or Tamil is better than her Kannada, even though she grew up in a Kannada-speaking family. So I think we have to both formally have our school system pay attention to including material in our school textbooks, so that children will become a lot more aware of differences and opportunities to learn, to know one another. But also, now with new technologies and new opportunities, I think instead of us all simply flocking with birds of the same feather, to try and look at what else is available and who else we can befriend, so that we actually, begin to learn about one another's habits, ways of thinking, and so on. Okay. A few other questions here. Let me take a look at the next one. Does our book offer insights on how to understand diverse communication styles? Okay. Yes and no. Now, communication style, we focus both on language differences as well as non-verbal differences. Okay. And I think, especially in terms of non-verbal differences, of course, we see that, especially through our movies and so on, we have kind of begin to have a little bit of knowledge of one another. But there's a lot of stereotyping also. So many of the Bollywood movies, and I think back of my own days growing up in Karnataka, the Bollywood movies tended to stereotype everyone else except the kind of unique Bollywood universe. Okay. And sometimes some of the stereotyping wasn't fun, wasn't lighthearted fun. But then they did very little to enable a real understanding of differences. So we had to go to what we would call the regional movies. So to understand something of Bengal, you had to kind of watch the Satyajit Ray movies or Mrinal Sen movies, or if you, and if you wanted to know a little bit more about Tamil Nadu, watch the Tamil movies. But those are difficult. And I think, and this is the reason why Professor Tombre and I said, we can standardize these. We can include these material both in our school textbooks and college courses. And our book, if you thumb through it, you will see chapters on nonverbal communication, on differences in worldviews, on differences in matters like, how we look at each other. In some regions or some states, people are much more what we would, to use a kind of a broad term, much more feudal in their approach to relationships. Okay, there's a lot of power distance. So the one who has power is a lot more powerful than the one who does not have power. And therefore, there is a lot more distance between the two. And therefore, a lot of oppression, a lot of discrimination. Okay. And then in some other places, there is less so. And we walk readers through all of those kinds of tools necessary to understand why people behave in one way or another. Okay. Another question: when we talk of India and its history to people who don't have much of an idea, where should we begin? How should we narrate our story? And do we include the greater Indic civilization of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and so on? And in fact, Mahalakshmi's question refers to our, the first two chapters in our book, where we trace Indian civilization. At least, we are not historians, both Professor Tombre and I. We have a smattering of knowledge based on our own reading of a variety of books. And of course, I have a little bit more understanding as a member of a variety of discussion groups where, I've had the opportunity of engaging with people who are indeed historians or linguists, experts in cultural studies and so on. And yes, we need to begin at the beginning, however far it goes, so that we understand the nature of Indian cultural habits, performances, traits, and beliefs. And without that, what will happen is that we become a kind of deracinated, rootless, modern people who think we are good because we are modern. We think we are good because we can quickly embrace what we think of as modern or progressive. But then we find out that if we are not rooted, we are also not a very happy people. So as individuals, if I distance myself away from my cultural upbringing, traditions, knowledge systems, and so on, I might be able to, for example, sit down with my white American friend and exchange a few things and then drink, and eat in a way that may make the other person think, oh yeah, Ramesh can actually hold his own in whatever kind of situation. But that is not it. But if my friend also begins to understand when he asks questions about my background, how knowledgeable I am and how I can explain to him or her about my roots, they are so much more fascinated about who I am. I am not simply a carpetbagger who knows or cares little about anything and am here just to make a living. So it is important, Mahalakshmi, that I think we have to understand our roots to be able to understand others. Okay, another question is globalization homogenizing language, code, symbols, and cultures? And how do we communicate as ourselves living in a different culture, different place? This is a challenge. I think we are living through times of quick changes, major changes. Therefore, it is both a time of opportunity and danger. It's both a time of difficulty and ease. Now, opportunities for those people, I know so many of my young nephews and nieces and cousins who are traveling all over the world with their base in India, in Bengaluru or in Chennai, and who are much more traveled than I am. Okay, and in a way, they are part of the global village. They are global citizens. They seem to be as much at ease doing business in Hong Kong for a couple of weeks and coming back, traveling business class, and having a particular ease and comfort dealing with the world. But what about my other young nephews, nieces, and cousins who have grown up in small town Karnataka, who are still doing the kinds of jobs that don't provide the opportunity of such travel? They don't have the kind of disposable income where they can even travel across India. For them, just like Americans who similarly don't have opportunities, the world becomes that much more of a difficult place to comprehend and a difficult place to live. They may enjoy access to their cell phones, but they're not at ease letting go of their rootedness, of their languages, of their ways of doing things, of their value systems. And when we say value systems, who do you marry? What do you eat? What do you drink? What do you not drink? Can you have boyfriends or girlfriends? What is the nature of, how many times do you go to a temple? What do you celebrate? What do you observe? What do you not observe? And we see this happening in India. There's a lot of pushback, especially against Hindu ways of doing things from those who think of themselves as modern or progressive. Okay. Here we see a real clash of civilizations or cultures within our own cultures. So it is not a clash of civilization between a Muslim and a Hindu, or a Hindu and a Christian, or a Christian and a Muslim, or a Japanese and an American, but among our own, between those who consider themselves modern and progressive and secular or whatever, to those who consider themselves as not necessarily traditional, but as a Hindu, or as whatever their label is for their own understanding of themselves. So yes, how and this is a tricky place to be in, and I think there is an attempt at maybe making us all modern and progressive. That's the whole kind of liberal worldview. But then there is also pushback, and and again, that is for another conversation, hopefully in the next coming weeks on the Indic book chat, so that we can talk a little bit more about this. Okay. Then, oh my goodness, there is a question here about music traditions that have been able to withstand, challenges from other traditions. But slowly we are seeing a trend in terms of fusion music. Will Indian traditional music go through changes? And then we have, a lot of churning, especially I think in traditional music fields. So, for example, in Carnatic music, there are people who are otherwise well trained, talented, who are challenging the system from within, and for reasons they, that sometimes are kind of idiosyncratic, or again in the name or under the label of progressive secular kind of goals. I think whatever is strong will continue. There will be changes. After all, change is that which we can expect in everything about human life. So with that, maybe very quick and not a complete answer. I think it's almost time for me to wind up. I hope this particular chat has been kind of useful, and it kind of, as I said, kickstart some conversations across groups across India, and I thank once again the wonderful organizers of the Indic book chat, and I hope you will tune in next week for another session here in terms of our live chats. Okay, it's been my pleasure and privilege to be here this Sunday, and I hope people will access this as and when they see the need. Thank you, and goodbye.